Mexican Border War. In the early 20th century, tensions along the U.S.-Mexico border escalated significantly due to the destabilizing effects of the Mexican Revolution. This instability led to a surge in cross-border raids, prompting intervention by the Texas Rangers and the U.S. Army to restore order. In 1916, the situation reached a critical point when Pancho Villa's guerrillas murdered 16 American miners and subsequently attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico. In response, U.S. cavalry troops counterattacked, scattering Villa's forces. President Woodrow Wilson then authorized a punitive expedition, sending 12,000 American troops under General John J. Pershing across the border to disrupt Villa's operations. World War I. During the years-long war raging in Europe, the Wilson administration maintained a policy of strict neutrality. Despite this, many Americans supported the British and French sides. German U-boat attacks on ships in the Atlantic, including the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, which killed 128 Americans, hardened public opinion against Germany. The U.S. demanded a stop to these attacks, but in 1917, the German Navy initiated unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking the SS Aztec and killing 28 Americans. The situation escalated with the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, a German plot to ally with Mexico and promise the return of territories lost in the Mexican-American War. This revelation, combined with continued U-boat attacks, led America to declare war on Germany. American troops, many of whom had gained experience from past conflicts, began arriving in France. Major combat operations commenced in 1918 with the Battle of Cantigny, where American forces demonstrated the effectiveness of synchronized operations involving infantry, artillery, tanks, engineers, and aviation. In the Battle of Belleau Wood, American Marines secured a costly but crucial victory, showcasing their combat readiness. Germany's attempt to launch a decisive offensive failed as American forces played a key role in the counterattack at the Marne, shifting the war's dynamics. The first American-led offensive, the Saint-Mihiel offensive, successfully pushed German forces back from the salient between Verdun and Metz. General John J. Pershing then led American troops into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a decisive campaign marked by fierce fighting and high casualties. Despite slow progress initially, American attacks eventually broke German defenses, leading to a rapid advance. An armistice was declared on November 11, 1918, ending combat. Peace talks continued into 1919, resulting in the Treaty of Versailles, which included the establishment of the League of Nations aimed at resolving international conflicts diplomatically. While President Wilson supported the League, Congress rejected the treaty and the League. Instead, the U.S. concluded a separate peace treaty with Germany in 1921, hoping for lasting peace. World War II. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, prompting the United States to attempt to remain neutral despite its close relations with England and France and widespread opposition to Nazi aggression. The U.S. began providing supplies to the Allies and preparing for possible war through the Selective Service. The situation escalated dramatically on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, leading to a U.S. declaration of war on Japan. Shortly thereafter, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, aligning the U.S. with England, the Soviet Union, and China. American women played significant roles in the war effort, serving as doctors, in uniformed military roles, and as factory workers. The U.S. initiated its military efforts in the Pacific, with a symbolic bombing raid on Tokyo led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle in 1942, which boosted American morale. A crucial victory at the Battle of Midway crippled the Japanese Navy and shifted the momentum in the Pacific. The U.S. employed an island-hopping strategy to capture key islands and isolate Japanese forces. This strategy involved intense battles across the Philippines and the East Indies, supported by Navy, Army Air Force, Marine aviators, and Coast Guard sailors. In Europe, American B-17S conducted the first bombing raid, targeting the rail yards at Sotteville-les-Rouen. U.S. ground forces entered the fight against Germany and Italy in North Africa, landing in Morocco and Algeria, and securing victory in Tunisia. They then moved on to Sicily and Italy, capturing Rome after fierce battles at Salerno and Anzio. The Normandy invasion, or D-Day, on June 6, 1944, marked a significant turning point as American and Allied forces established a foothold in France. After breaking out of the Normandy beachhead, the Allies advanced through France and launched Operation Market Garden to outflank the Siegfried Line, though this attack ultimately failed. The Germans launched a final offensive in the Ardennes, resulting in the Battle of the Bulge. Despite initial successes, American troops mounted a strong defense and counterattack, stabilizing the front. As the Allies pushed towards Berlin, German resistance collapsed, leading to Nazi Germany's surrender. In the Pacific, the battle for the Mariana Islands and other campaigns, such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the grueling fights on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, set the stage for a final assault on Japan. Facing predictions of massive casualties, American leaders opted to use atomic weapons to force a swift end to the war. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 led to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marking the end of World War II. With the war over, the world began a long and challenging recovery process. Korean War. After World War II ended, Korea, formerly a Japanese colony for 35 years, was divided by the Soviet Union and the United States along the 38th parallel into two occupation zones. The initial plan was to establish an independent Korea, but political disagreements led each zone to form its own government by 1948. Kim Il-sung led the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, from Pyongyang, while Syngman Rhee governed the Republic of Korea, South Korea, from Seoul. Both governments claimed sole legitimacy over the entire Korean peninsula and engaged in skirmishes along the 38th parallel. South Korea, under Seoul's leadership, also faced communist uprisings. Tensions escalated when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. In response, the United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union absent, condemned the invasion and called for member countries to repel the North Korean Army, KPA, under the United Nations Command, UNC, predominantly led by the United States. Initially, the South Korean Army, ROKA, and its allies struggled and were nearly overwhelmed, holding on to only the Pusan perimeter. In September 1950, UN forces executed a decisive landing at Incheon, severing KPA supply lines and enabling a swift invasion into North Korea. By October 1950, advancing towards the Yalu River, the border with China. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, intervened on October 19, 1950, pushing UN forces back from North Korea in subsequent offensives. The conflict saw Seoul briefly recaptured by communist forces in January 1951 before its eventual loss. The remaining 2 years of the war devolved into a protracted war of attrition along the 38th parallel. The Korean War concluded on July 27, 1953, with the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement. This agreement facilitated the exchange of prisoners of war and established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, as a buffer between North and South Korea. The conflict resulted in widespread displacement, with around 3 million fatalities, predominantly civilians, marking a higher proportion of deaths compared to World War II or the Vietnam War. Allegations of war crimes included the killing of suspected communists by Seoul and the mistreatment of prisoners of war by North Korea. North Korea endured extensive bombing campaigns during the war, leading to significant destruction across its major cities. Despite the armistice, no formal peace treaty was ever signed, leaving the Korean peninsula in a state of unresolved tension, often referred to as a frozen conflict. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a conflict in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia from November 1, 1955 to the fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975. It was the second of the Indochina Wars and a major Cold War conflict. North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist states, fought against South Vietnam, supported by the US and anti-communist allies, making it a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union. The war lasted nearly 20 years, with direct US military involvement ending in 1973. The conflict also affected Laos and Cambodia, which, along with Vietnam, became communist by 1975. Following the 1954 Geneva Conference, Vietnam was divided. The Viet Minh controlled North Vietnam, and the US supported South Vietnam. The Viet Cong, VC, directed by North Vietnam, initiated guerrilla warfare in the south, while the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, engaged in conventional warfare. U.S. involvement escalated, especially after the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, leading to increased military presence and combat operations. Significant events include the Tet Offensive in 1968, which, despite being a tactical defeat for the North, eroded U.S. public support for the war. President Nixon's Vietnamization policy aimed to shift combat roles to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing U.S. troops. The 1973 Paris Peace Accords ended direct U.S. involvement, but fighting continued until the fall of Saigon in 1975, leading to the reunification of Vietnam. The war caused extensive casualties and destruction, with Vietnamese deaths estimated between 970,000 and 3 million, significant losses in Cambodia and Laos, and 58,220 U.S. service members killed. The war precipitated the Vietnamese refugee crisis and contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in the U.S., alongside environmental devastation from the use of toxic herbicides. Laotian Civil War. The Laotian Civil War, lasting from May 23, 1959 to December 2, 1975, was a conflict between the Communist Pathet Lao and the Royal Lao government. It took place during the Vietnam War era, making Laos a covert Cold War battleground with significant involvement from global superpowers, including North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, American, and Thai forces. The conflict's origins trace back to the 1953 Franco-Lao Treaty of Amity and Association, which granted Laos independence but excluded the Laoisara anti-colonial movement. This exclusion led to political rivalry among neutralists, right-wing factions, and left-wing groups, with multiple unsuccessful attempts at forming coalition governments. In 1958 and 1959, the North Vietnamese Army, collaborating with the Pathet Lao, invaded Laos to establish the Ho Chi Minh Trail and stage offensives into South Vietnam. The war had two major fronts, the Laotian Panhandle and the Northern Plain of Jars. From 1961, the U.S. trained Hmong tribesmen to disrupt North Vietnamese operations and began bombing supply routes in 1964. The war ended in December 1975 with the victory of the North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao, following North Vietnam's triumph over South Vietnam. This resulted in up to 300,000 Laotians fleeing to Thailand, and the onset of a Hmong insurgency against the new communist government. The Hmong people faced severe persecution as American collaborators, suffering human rights abuses from the regime and its Vietnamese allies. Accusations of Chinese support for Hmong rebels further complicated the conflict amid Sino-Vietnamese tensions. Overall, the war claimed over 40,000 lives. The Pathet Lao arrested the Lao royal family, sending them to labor camps, where most, including King Savangvathana, Queen Kamphui, and Crown Prince Vong Savang, perished in the late 1970s and 1980s. Dominican Civil War. The Dominican Civil War, also known as the April Revolution, took place from April 24th to September 3rd, 1965, in Santo Domingo. The conflict began when supporters of ousted President Juan Bosch overthrew military-installed President Donald Reed Cabral. General Elias Wessin U. Wessin responded by organizing a campaign against Bosch's constitutionalist rebels. Fears of communist influence led to a U.S. intervention, Operation Power Pack, later evolving into an OAS occupation. The significant battle on June 15, 1965, resulted in casualties on both sides. The war ended with the 1966 election of Joaquin Balaguer, leading to foreign troop withdrawal and around 6,000 Dominican and 350 U.S. casualties. United States invasion of Grenada. On October 25, 1983, the United States, with 6 Caribbean nations, launched Operation Urgent Fury, a military invasion of Grenada, 100 miles north of Venezuela. This swift occupation was triggered by internal strife within Grenada's People's Revolutionary Government, following the house arrest and execution of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and the rise of the Revolutionary Military Council, led by Hudson Austin. Officially to protect 600 U.S. medical students, the invasion aimed to depose Austin. The operation, involving 7,600 troops, quickly overcame resistance, deposing Austin's government and establishing an interim council until the 1984 elections. The invasion faced international criticism and led to significant U.S. military reforms. United States invasion of Panama. In mid-December 1989, the United States, under President George H.W. Bush, invaded Panama to depose General Manuel Noriega, who was wanted for racketeering and drug trafficking. The operation, named Operation Just Cause, concluded in late January 1990 with Noriega's surrender. The Panama Defense Forces were dissolved, and Guillermo Endara was sworn in as president. The invasion, which saw 516 Panamanians and 26 Americans killed, was condemned by the UN and OAS as a violation of international law, but led to long-term democratization in Panama. Gulf War. The Gulf War, led by the US under President George H.W. Bush, saw a coalition of 35 nations respond to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Operation Desert Shield defended Gulf states, followed by Operation Desert Storm's swift offensive from January to February 1991. The campaign liberated Kuwait, crippled Iraq's military, and reshaped Middle Eastern dynamics, yet led to lasting regional instability. America's leadership highlighted its military prowess and commitment to Gulf stability.